Alexander Morrison stood at the massive window of his penthouse office, watching the city spread below him like a glittering web of lights. At 28, he had everything most people could only dream of. His father's business empire stretched across 3 continents, and as the heir to Morrison Industries, Alexander's future seemed brighter than the diamonds that sparkled in the engagement ring he kept turning over in his fingers. The ring was meant for Victoria Sterling, the woman who had captured his heart 6 months ago at a charity gala. She was everything he thought he wanted in a wife, beautiful, sophisticated, and from a family that moved in the same elite circles as his own. Their engagement had been the talk of high society, with wedding plans that promised to be the event of the century. But something had been bothering Alexander lately. Small things at first. The way Victoria's eyes would go cold when she thought he wasn't looking, or how she always seemed to be whispering with her brother Marcus about business matters that didn't concern her. Alexander had built his reputation on reading people, a skill that served him well in the corporate world. Yet with Victoria, he found himself second-guessing his instincts. The Morrison family estate sat on 50 acres of pristine land outside the city, surrounded by ancient oak trees and manicured gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines. The main house was a sprawling mansion with 32 rooms, each one decorated with priceless art and antiques collected over generations. It was here that Alexander had grown up, learning from his father, Richard Morrison, about responsibility, legacy, and the weight of carrying a family name that meant something. Maria Santos had worked as head housekeeper at the Morrison estate for 15 years. She had watched Alexander grow from a rebellious teenager into a capable young man who treated the staff with genuine respect and kindness. Unlike many wealthy families she had worked for, the Morrisons never made her feel invisible or unimportant. Alexander especially had always taken time to ask about her family, remember her children's names, and even help pay for her daughter's medical treatments when she couldn't afford them. On the morning that would change everything, Maria arrived at work earlier than usual. She had promised to help prepare the estate for Alexander's birthday celebration the following week. As she entered through the service entrance, she noticed Victoria's car already parked in the circular driveway. This struck her as odd, since Victoria rarely visited so early in the day, preferring to arrive fashionably late for most occasions. Maria began her morning routine, starting with the kitchen and working her way through the main floor. The house felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on what had changed. There was a tension in the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. She had learned to trust these feelings over the years, especially when it came to protecting the family she had grown to love. As she dusted the library, Maria heard voices coming from Alexander's study down the hall. She recognized Victoria's refined accent, but there was something sharp in her tone that made Maria pause in her work. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the intensity of the conversation drew her attention. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying a coldness that Maria had never heard before. "Everything is already in place. The documents are ready, the accounts are prepared. All we need is your signature and this will all be over." Alexander's response was harder to make out, but Maria could hear the confusion in his voice. "Victoria, I don't understand what you're talking about. What documents? What accounts?" Maria moved closer to the doorway, her cleaning supplies forgotten. Something was very wrong. In all her years working for the family, she had never heard anyone speak to Alexander with such calculated cruelty. "Don't play innocent with me, Alexander. You're going to sign over your inheritance to me, and then we're going to have a little accident. Something tragic and unexpected, the grieving fiancée who loses her beloved just days before their wedding. It's almost poetic, don't you think?" The blood drained from Maria's face as the full meaning of Victoria's words sank in. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they would hear it. This couldn't be happening. Not to Alexander, not to the young man who had been like a son to her. "You're insane," Alexander said, his voice rising. "I would never sign anything under these circumstances. And what are you talking about, an accident? Victoria? What's going on here?" Maria heard the sound of papers rustling, followed by Victoria's laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of warmth or humanity. "You really think you have a choice? Look around, Alexander. Where do you think you are right now?" For the first time, Maria realized how quiet the house had been all morning. Usually, she would have encountered other staff members by now. The security guards who normally patrolled the grounds were nowhere to be seen. Even Thomas, the longtime butler who never missed a day of work, was absent. "Marcus took care of the staff situation," Victoria continued, as if reading Maria's thoughts. "Amazing what people will do for the right amount of money. Your father's security team won't be back until tomorrow, and by then, this will all be resolved." Maria's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. Victoria had somehow managed to isolate Alexander in his own home, removing all the people who might protect him. But she was still here, still hidden, still able to do something to help. She just had to figure out what. "The injection will make you drowsy," Victoria was explaining in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Nothing painful, I promise, and then we'll take a little trip to the old wine cellar. You remember that section your grandfather had sealed off years ago? It turns out it's the perfect size for what we need." Maria's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The old wine cellar had been closed off when she first started working at the estate. Alexander's grandfather had it sealed after a section partially collapsed, deeming it too dangerous and expensive to repair. No one had been down there in decades. "You're talking about murder," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Even if you somehow get away with this, people will ask questions. My father will never stop looking for answers. Your father will be devastated, of course. But grief makes people vulnerable, and Marcus has been cultivating a relationship with him for months now. Amazing how a shoulder to cry on can turn into a trusted business advisor. Within a year, Marcus will have worked his way into controlling interest of Morrison Industries. It's really quite elegant." The pieces of an elaborate plan were falling into place, and Maria realized this had been in motion far longer than just today. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. Victoria and her brother had been systematically positioning themselves to destroy the Morrison family and steal everything they had built. Maria heard the sound of a struggle from the study, followed by Alexander's voice, slurred and confused. "What did you give me? Victoria, what did you do?" "Just something to help you relax," Victoria replied. "We need you conscious for the signing, but cooperative. Don't worry, it will all be over soon." Maria knew she had only minutes to act. Alexander was being drugged, and soon Victoria would move him to the sealed wine cellar. Once he was down there, it would be impossible for anyone to hear him or find him in time. She had to think of a way to help him without revealing her presence and putting herself in the same danger. The sound of Victoria's heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved around the study. "Marcus should be here soon with the equipment we need. He's quite handy with construction work, you know. Amazing what you can learn when you're motivated by several $100 million. Maria realized that Marcus Sterling was coming to help bury Alexander alive. The thought made her stomach turn, but it also gave her an idea. If Marcus wasn't here yet, that meant she still had time to act. She needed to find a way to contact help without alerting Victoria to her presence. Moving as quietly as possible, Maria made her way to the kitchen where the house phone was located. Her hands shook as she dialed the number for the estate's security office, hoping that Victoria had been wrong about getting to everyone. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried Alexander's personal security detail next, but their phones seemed to be turned off or out of service. Fighting back panic, Maria tried to think of who else might be able to help. Alexander's father was traveling in Europe on business and wouldn't be reachable for hours. The local police would take too long to respond, and she had no proof of what was happening beyond her own testimony. She needed someone who could act immediately and who would believe her without question. Then she remembered Dr. James Holbrook, Alexander's longtime friend and personal physician. He lived only 20 minutes away and had given Maria his number years ago in case of any medical emergencies involving the family. If anyone would drop everything to help Alexander, it would be Dr. Holbrook. As she dialed his number, Maria heard a car door slam outside. Marcus Sterling had arrived. Through the kitchen window, she could see him unloading equipment from his trunk: shovels, bags of quick-setting concrete, and what looked like breathing apparatus. The sight confirmed her worst fears about what they planned to do to Alexander. "Dr. Holbrook?" Maria whispered into the phone when he answered. "This is Maria Santos from the Morrison estate. I need your help. Alexander is in terrible danger." "Maria? What's happening? Is Alexander injured?" "His fiancée is drugging him. She's planning to bury him alive in the old wine cellar. She wants his inheritance. Doctor, you have to come right now, but be careful. Her brother is here too." There was a moment of silence as Dr. Holbrook processed this information. Maria held her breath, praying he would believe her and not think she had lost her mind. "I'm on my way," he said finally. "Stay hidden and don't try to confront them yourself. I'm calling the police now." Maria ended the call and crept back toward the study. Staying low and moving through the servants' corridors that honeycombed the old mansion. She could hear Marcus and Victoria talking in low voices, discussing the logistics of their plan with the casual efficiency of people who had rehearsed every detail. "The cellar access is through the basement," Marcus was saying. "We can take him down the back stairs to avoid any windows. Once he's secured, we seal the entrance with the concrete. Even if someone eventually finds it, it will look like an old repair job from years ago." "How long will the air last?" Victoria asked. "With the breathing apparatus, maybe 6 hours. Long enough to establish our alibi. But not long enough for anyone to mount a rescue if they somehow figure out where he is." Maria felt sick listening to them plan Alexander's death with such cold calculation. These people had no conscience, no humanity left in them. They were willing to slowly suffocate a man who had never done anything to hurt them, all for money and power. She made her way to the main staircase, where she could see down into the foyer. Alexander was slumped in a chair, clearly struggling against the effects of whatever drug Victoria had given him. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he seemed to be having trouble coordinating his movements. "The drug is working perfectly," Victoria observed with satisfaction. "He's conscious enough to sign the documents but too impaired to resist or escape. Marcus, help me get him to the study desk." Maria watched in horror as they half-carried, half-dragged Alexander to his own desk, where legal documents were spread out waiting for his signature. Even in his drugged state, Alexander seemed to understand what was happening and tried to resist, but his movements were slow and uncoordinated. "Just sign your name, Alexander," Victoria cooed, her voice taking on the sweet tone she used in public. "Make this easy on yourself. The sooner you cooperate, the sooner this will all be over." "Never," Alexander managed to say, though his voice was slurred. Won't let you." Marcus grabbed Alexander's hand and forced a pen into it. "Sign it, or we'll make this much more unpleasant for you. The drug can have some very uncomfortable side effects if we increase the dosage." Maria realized she couldn't wait for Dr. Holbrook to arrive. Alexander was being forced to sign away his inheritance at this very moment, and once that was done, they would take him to the cellar. She had to do something to delay them, to buy time for help to arrive. Looking around the mansion she knew so well, Maria remembered the old servant's bell system that had been installed in the house decades ago. While most of the bells no longer worked, a few were still connected to the main electrical system. If she could trigger the fire alarm, it might create enough confusion and noise to disrupt their plans. Moving quickly through the back corridors, Maria made her way to the utility room where the electrical panels were located. She had watched the maintenance crews work on the systems over the years and had a basic understanding of how they operated. Her hands were shaking as she located the fire alarm controls and activated the emergency system. Immediately, the mansion filled with the ear-piercing sound of fire alarms. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the house, and the automated voice system started announcing the evacuation procedures. The noise was deafening and would certainly mask any other sounds in the house. Through the chaos of the alarms, Maria could hear Victoria shouting angrily at Marcus. "What's happening? Is there really a fire?" "It's probably just a malfunction," Marcus shouted back. "These old systems act up all the time. We need to finish this and get him downstairs before the fire department shows up." But the constant noise and flashing lights were clearly affecting their ability to force Alexander to sign the documents. In his drugged state, the sensory overload was making him even more confused and uncooperative. Maria had bought them some time, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She made her way toward the front of the house, hoping to see Dr. Holbrook's car coming up the driveway. Instead, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Marcus was dragging Alexander toward the back stairs that led to the basement, while Victoria gathered up the unsigned documents. They were moving to the next phase of their plan, whether Alexander had signed the papers or not. The fire alarms continued their deafening wail as Maria watched Marcus drag Alexander down the back staircase toward the basement. Alexander's legs barely supported his weight, and his head lolled forward as the drugs continued to take effect. Victoria followed close behind, clutching the unsigned documents and cursing under her breath about the unexpected complication. Maria knew the layout of the basement better than almost anyone. She had spent countless hours down there over the years, organizing storage areas and helping with seasonal decorations. The sealed wine cellar was in the oldest section of the house, behind what appeared to be a solid brick wall. Alexander's grandfather had done such a thorough job of concealing the entrance that most people had forgotten it ever existed. Moving through the servants' passages, Maria managed to reach the basement ahead of them. She positioned herself behind a large storage cabinet where she could see what was happening without being detected. The basement was dimly lit, with only a few overhead bulbs casting long shadows across the stone walls. Marcus dragged Alexander to an old wooden workbench and propped him up against it. Alexander's eyes were still open, but he seemed unable to focus on anything for more than a few seconds. The drug was clearly designed to keep him conscious but helpless, which made Maria's heart ache for what he was going through. "Where's the entrance to the sealed section?" Victoria demanded, looking around the basement with frustration. "I thought you said you had this all figured out." "It's behind that brick wall." Marcus pointed to a section that looked identical to the rest of the basement walls. "Grandfather Morrison did a good job hiding it, but I found the architectural plans at the city planning office. There's a hidden mechanism behind the third brick from the corner." Maria watched in fascination and horror as Marcus pressed against various bricks until one gave way slightly. There was a clicking sound, and suddenly a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark passage beyond. The engineering was impressive, but Maria realized it would also make it nearly impossible for anyone to find Alexander once they sealed him inside. The air that flowed out from the hidden chamber was stale and cold, carrying the musty scent of decades of abandonment. Marcus shone a flashlight into the space, revealing a small room with stone walls and an arched ceiling. It had probably once been a luxury wine storage area, but now it looked like a tomb waiting for its occupant. "Perfect," Victoria said with satisfaction. "No one will ever think to look here. Even if they do, they'll need the architectural plans to figure out how to open it." Marcus began unloading his equipment, setting up what appeared to be a sophisticated breathing apparatus connected to a small oxygen tank. Maria realized with growing horror that they intended to keep Alexander alive for hours while they established their alibis, letting him slowly suffocate in the darkness while they played the part of concerned loved ones looking for him. "The oxygen will last about 6 hours," Marcus explained as he worked. "Long enough for us to drive into the city, have dinner at that restaurant where we made reservations, and establish that we were nowhere near here when he disappeared. By the time anyone starts seriously looking for him, it will be too late." Alexander stirred slightly, seeming to become more aware of his surroundings. "What? Where am I?" he mumbled, trying to lift his head. "Maria? Is Maria here? She'll help me." Victoria laughed cruelly. "Maria isn't here, darling. In fact, no one is here. We made sure of that. It's just you, me, and Marcus. And very soon, it will just be me and Marcus." But Alexander's mention of Maria had given her an idea. She knew the basement better than either of them did, including several features they probably weren't aware of. The wine cellar they were planning to use as Alexander's tomb had originally been connected to the main house through a dumbwaiter system that had been used to transport bottles up to the dining room. The dumbwaiter had been sealed off decades ago, but Maria remembered helping to store Christmas decorations in the shaft just last year. If she could somehow reach the dumbwaiter shaft, she might be able to create another way into the sealed chamber. It would be dangerous and difficult, but it could be Alexander's only chance of survival if Dr. Holbrook didn't arrive in time. As Marcus and Victoria prepared their makeshift prison, Maria quietly made her way to the far end of the basement, where the old dumbwaiter entrance was hidden behind stacks of stored furniture. She had to move carefully to avoid making noise that might alert them to her presence. The fire alarms were still blaring upstairs, which helped mask any small sounds she made. The dumbwaiter shaft was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Maria had always been small, which had served her well in her work, but this would test the limits of what she could physically manage. She found a flashlight in a nearby storage box and used it to examine the shaft. The old pulley system was still intact, though the ropes looked worn and frayed. More importantly, she could see that the shaft did indeed connect to the wine cellar area. There was a small opening about halfway down that had been covered with a metal grate, probably to prevent bottles from falling into the shaft during transport. Meanwhile, she could hear Marcus and Victoria moving Alexander into position. His voice was stronger now, as if the adrenaline of fear was helping him fight off some effects of the drug. "You won't get away with this," Alexander said, his words clearer than they had been. "People will ask questions. My father will tear this city apart looking for me." "Your father will be too busy grieving to ask the right questions," Victoria replied. "And by the time he does, Marcus and I will be in control of enough of his assets to redirect any investigation we want." "You underestimate him," Alexander warned. "He didn't build this empire by being naive or trusting. He'll see through whatever story you're planning to tell." Marcus secured the breathing apparatus over Alexander's face, adjusting the flow rate on the small oxygen tank. "He'll see a tragic accident that took his son just before the wedding, the grieving fiancée who inherits everything she was about to gain anyway. People believe what makes sense to them, and grief makes people want simple answers." Maria had heard enough. She squeezed into the dumbwaiter shaft, using her hands and feet to brace herself against the walls as she lowered herself down toward the wine cellar level. The shaft was cramped and uncomfortable, and she had to fight off claustrophobia as the walls pressed in around her. Spiderwebs brushed against her face, and she could hear rats scurrying away from her flashlight beam. About halfway down, she reached the metal grate that covered the opening to the wine cellar. Through the slats, she could see into the chamber where they were planning to imprison Alexander. The grate was held in place with old screws that had rusted over the decades, making them difficult to turn. Maria used her house keys to try to loosen them, working as quietly as possible. Above her in the basement, she could hear Victoria and Marcus making their final preparations. "The documents can wait until later," Victoria was saying. "We'll figure out another way to get his signature on them." The important thing is to get him secured before anyone else shows up. What about the fire alarms? Marcus asked. Should we check if there's an actual fire? It's probably just the old system malfunctioning. These historical houses are always having electrical problems. We'll deal with it after we finish here. Maria finally managed to loosen the screws enough to remove the grate. The opening was small, but she thought she could squeeze through it if necessary. More importantly, it would allow her to communicate with Alexander once they sealed him in the chamber. She could hear them moving Alexander through the hidden entrance now. His voice echoed strangely in the stone chamber as he continued to resist. This is insane, Victoria. Even if you get my money, what kind of life will you have knowing what you did to get it? A very comfortable life, Victoria replied without emotion. Money has a wonderful way of easing one's conscience. I'll learn to live with the sacrifice I had to make. Maria positioned herself at the grate opening and waited. She could see light from their flashlights moving around the chamber as they secured Alexander to a chair they had brought down for that purpose. The breathing apparatus would keep him alive but helpless, unable to shout for help or remove the equipment himself. There, Marcus said with satisfaction. The oxygen flow is set for maximum duration. He'll be conscious for most of it, which is unfortunate, but necessary for our timing to work. I almost feel sorry for you, Victoria told Alexander, though her tone suggested she felt nothing of the kind. If you had just signed the papers and made this easy, it could have been much quicker, but you always were stubborn. They moved back toward the entrance, and Maria heard the heavy stone door beginning to swing shut. Once it closed and they sealed it with concrete, Alexander would be trapped in complete darkness with only the sound of his own breathing and the steady hiss of the oxygen tank. But just before the door closed completely, Maria called out through the grate. Alexander, can you hear me? It's Maria. Alexander's head turned toward the sound of her voice, hope flickering in his eyes. Victoria and Marcus froze, looking around frantically for the source of the voice. Maria! Alexander called back, his voice muffled by the breathing apparatus, but filled with relief. Where are you? There's someone else down here, Marcus hissed to Victoria. We missed someone. Victoria's face twisted with rage. Find them! We can't leave any witnesses! But Maria had already pulled back from the grate opening, making herself as small as possible in the narrow shaft. She turned off her flashlight and held perfectly still, listening to their footsteps as they searched the basement for her. Maria Santos! Victoria called out, her cultured accent now carrying a note of desperation. I know you're down here somewhere. Come out now and we can work something out. I'm sure we can find a way to compensate you for your discretion. Maria said nothing, knowing that any sound could give away her position. Through the basement wall, she could hear the fire alarms still wailing upstairs. She wondered if Dr. Holbrook had arrived yet, or if the fire department was responding to the alarm. Either way, she knew that Marcus and Victoria couldn't stay much longer without risking discovery. We don't have time for this, Marcus said urgently. If the fire department shows up and finds us down here with him, we'll never be able to explain it. We can't just leave knowing someone else is aware of our plan, Victoria argued. She could ruin everything. Look at this place, Marcus gestured around the vast basement. There are 100 places someone could hide down here. We could spend hours searching and still not find her. Meanwhile, emergency responders could arrive at any moment. Maria heard them moving back toward the sealed chamber where Alexander was trapped. Through the grate, she could see the glow of their flashlights as they made their decision. We go with the original plan, Victoria decided. Seal him in and get out of here. Even if this maid knows something, who's going to believe her? A domestic worker against the word of the Sterling family? We'll deal with her later if necessary. What about the fire alarms? Marcus asked again. We'll say we came by to check on Alexander when we heard the alarms, but he wasn't here. We'll express concern and offer to help look for him. Perfect setup for what comes next. Maria listened in horror as they began mixing the quick-setting concrete that would permanently seal Alexander's fate. The mechanical sound of the mixing paddle echoed through the basement as they prepared to entomb him alive. Through the grate, she could see Alexander struggling against his restraints. The breathing apparatus was working, providing him with oxygen, but she could see the terror in his eyes as he realized what was happening. He was going to be buried alive, conscious and aware, slowly suffocating in the darkness while the people who claimed to love him went about their normal lives. "Alexander," Maria whispered through the grate, just loud enough for him to hear. "I'm going to get help. Don't give up. Dr. Holbrook is coming." Alexander nodded slightly, indicating he had heard her. She could see him trying to work at the restraints that held him to the chair, but the drugs were still affecting his coordination and strength. The concrete was ready now, and Maria could hear Marcus and Victoria working to seal the entrance to the chamber. Once they finished, the hidden door would be invisible again, covered with what would appear to be normal basement wall repair work. Unless someone knew exactly what to look for, they would never find the entrance. "Done," Marcus announced with satisfaction. "Even if someone somehow figures out there's a chamber back there, it would take construction equipment to break through this seal." "Perfect," Victoria said. "Now let's get upstairs and establish our alibi. We need to be seen leaving the property before anyone arrives to investigate the fire alarm." Maria heard their footsteps moving away from the sealed chamber and up the basement stairs. She waited until she was certain they were gone before moving back to the grate opening. In the darkness beyond, she could barely make out Alexander's form in the chair, the small green light on the oxygen tank, the only indication that the life support system was still functioning. "Alexander," she called softly. "Are you still there?" "Yes," came his muffled reply. "Maria, you have to get help. The oxygen won't last forever." "I called Dr. Holbrook. He should be here soon. I'm going to try to find another way to get you out of there." Maria studied the chamber through the grate, trying to assess their options. The opening she was speaking through was too small for Alexander to escape through, even if she could somehow get the restraints off him. The sealed entrance was the only realistic way in or out, but breaking through Marcus's concrete work would require tools and time they might not have. Then she heard something that filled her with both hope and terror. Car doors were slamming in the driveway above, followed by the sound of multiple vehicles arriving. It could be Dr. Holbrook coming to help, but it could also be the fire department responding to the alarm, or worse, it could be Victoria and Marcus returning with more people to help cover up their crime. The fire alarms were still screaming throughout the house, which would make communication difficult and create confusion for anyone trying to understand what was happening. Maria realized she needed to get upstairs quickly to guide the right people to Alexander's location before it was too late. But first, she had to make sure Alexander understood what she was doing. "I have to go upstairs now," she told him through the grate. "People are arriving and I need to get help down here. Keep working on those restraints. Every minute counts." "Maria," Alexander called after her as she began to climb back up the shaft. "Be careful. If Victoria and Marcus are still up there, they'll do anything to protect themselves now." Maria knew he was right. Victoria and Marcus had already committed themselves to murder. If they realized she could expose them, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another witness. But Alexander's life was running out with every breath he took from that oxygen tank, and she was the only person who knew where he was. As she climbed through the narrow shaft, Maria could hear voices and footsteps from the floor above. Multiple people were now in the house, and she could hear shouting over the continued wailing of the fire alarms. She had to get up there and find Dr. Holbrook before Victoria and Marcus convinced everyone that this was just a false alarm and sent the responders away. The fate of Alexander Morrison now rested in the hands of a housekeeper who had dedicated her life to protecting the family she loved. And somewhere above them, the people who had tried to destroy that family were probably spinning a web of lies to cover their tracks. The race against time had begun, and Maria Santos was Alexander's only hope of survival. Maria emerged from the dumbwaiter shaft covered in dust and cobwebs, her heart racing as she made her way through the basement toward the stairs. The voices from above were getting louder, and she could distinguish at least 3 different people shouting to be heard over the fire alarms. She prayed that Dr. Holbrook was among them and that Victoria and Marcus hadn't managed to turn the situation to their advantage. As she reached the basement stairs, Maria could hear Victoria's voice rising above the others. Even through the noise of the alarms, her practiced tone of distressed concern was unmistakable. "I have no idea where Alexander could be," Victoria was saying, her voice pitched perfectly to convey worried confusion. "When I heard the fire alarms, I rushed over immediately, but the house seems to be empty. This is so unlike him to just disappear without telling anyone." Maria climbed the stairs carefully, staying low to avoid being seen before she could assess the situation. Through the doorway to the main hall, she could see Dr. Holbrook standing near the front entrance, still in his coat and holding his medical bag. Relief flooded through her, as she realized he had received her call and come immediately. But her relief turned to alarm when she saw that Marcus was positioned between Dr. Holbrook and the rest of the house, clearly trying to control the conversation. 2 firefighters were present as well, having responded to the alarm system, and Victoria was doing her best to convince everyone that this was simply a malfunction. "The alarm system in these old houses can be quite temperamental," Victoria was explaining to the fire chief. "I'm sure it's just a false alarm. Alexander probably went out for his morning run and forgot to mention it to anyone. You know how men can be about keeping people informed of their plans." Dr. Holbrook looked skeptical. "Maria called me about an emergency involving Alexander. She seemed quite distressed and specifically mentioned that he was in danger." "Maria?" Victoria's voice took on a note of condescension. "Oh, the housekeeper. She's always been rather dramatic about things. I'm sure she misunderstood some perfectly innocent conversation and let her imagination run away with her. You know how domestic staff can be about family matters." Maria realized she had to act now before Victoria managed to convince everyone to leave. Alexander's oxygen tank had a limited supply, and every minute of delay brought him closer to suffocation. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from the stairway and into the main hall. "Dr. Holbrook," she called out, ignoring Victoria's sharp intake of breath. "Thank God you're here. Alexander is trapped in the basement. They buried him alive in the old wine cellar." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Holbrook stepped forward urgently while the firefighters turned their full attention to her. Victoria's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "Maria, what on earth are you talking about?" Victoria said with a nervous laugh. "You're clearly overwrought. Perhaps you should sit down and—" "She drugged him," Maria continued, pointing directly at Victoria. "I heard everything. She and her brother planned this whole thing to steal his inheritance. They gave him some kind of injection to make him helpless, then sealed him in the old wine cellar with just an oxygen tank." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "This is insane. You're going to take the word of a domestic worker over—" "Where is Alexander right now?" Dr. Holbrook interrupted, his medical training focusing him on the immediate emergency. "Maria, show me exactly where he is." "The old wine cellar that was sealed off years ago. They've hidden the entrance with concrete, but I know another way in. Doctor, we have to hurry. The oxygen won't last much longer." The fire chief was already calling for additional emergency personnel and specialized equipment. If someone is trapped underground, we need a full rescue response. "How long has he been sealed in?" Maria tried to calculate the time that had passed since she first overheard Victoria's plan. "At least an hour, maybe more. They said the oxygen would last about 6 hours, but I don't know how accurate that is." Victoria made one last attempt to control the narrative. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm his fiancée. Why would I want to hurt him? Maria is clearly having some sort of breakdown. Because you want his money, Maria said firmly. I heard you talking about forged inheritance documents and getting control of Morrison Industries through your brother. You planned this whole thing. Dr. Holbrook was already moving toward the basement stairs. We'll sort out the accusations later. Right now, if there's any chance Alexander is trapped down there, we need to get him out immediately. Maria, lead the way. The group moved quickly through the house toward the basement. Victoria and Marcus, having no choice but to follow along or risk making their guilt even more obvious. Maria could see the panic starting to show in their eyes as their carefully laid plans fell apart around them. In the basement, Maria led them directly to the area where the wine cellar had been sealed. To anyone unfamiliar with the original layout, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary basement wall. But under Maria's guidance, Dr. Holbrook and the firefighters began to examine the area more closely. Here, Maria pointed to the section that Marcus had sealed with concrete. This is where they trapped him. But the concrete is fresh and thick. It will take too long to break through. There's another way? Dr. Holbrook asked. Maria showed them the dumbwaiter shaft and explained how she had been able to communicate with Alexander through the grate. The opening is too small to get him out, but we can talk to him and maybe pass him additional oxygen supplies. While one firefighter climbed into the shaft to establish communication with Alexander, the others began setting up equipment to break through the concrete seal. The sound of their power tools echoed through the basement as they worked to create an opening large enough for a rescue. Alexander, the firefighter called through the grate. Can you hear me? This is the fire department. We're coming to get you out. Alexander's voice came back, weaker now but still conscious. I can hear you. The oxygen is getting low. I'm feeling dizzy. Dr. Holbrook took charge of the medical situation. Alexander, this is James. I need you to try to slow your breathing and conserve the oxygen as much as possible. We're breaking through the wall now. How are you feeling otherwise? Dizzy. Hard to think clearly. Whatever Victoria gave me is still affecting me. But I can move a little now. The restraints are loose. Victoria, who had been standing silently while the rescue operation unfolded, suddenly made a break for the basement stairs. But one of the firefighters had positioned himself to block any escape routes, having been briefed by the fire chief about the potential criminal nature of the situation. Going somewhere? The firefighter asked as Victoria found her path blocked. Marcus tried a different approach, stepping forward with apparent concern. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Victoria and I came here this morning to surprise Alexander with wedding planning documents. When the fire alarm went off, we were just as confused as everyone else. Then explain the breathing apparatus and the fresh concrete work, Maria challenged him. Explain why you had construction equipment and quick-setting concrete in your car. Marcus's face went pale as he realized that his car, still parked outside, contained all the evidence of their premeditation. The shovels, concrete mix, and specialized equipment would be impossible to explain away as coincidental. Through the wall, they could hear the power tools making progress. The old stone and mortar construction was giving way under the assault of modern rescue equipment, but it was slow work. Every minute that passed increased the risk that Alexander's oxygen supply would run out. "We're through!" one of the firefighters called out as a section of the wall finally crumbled away. Emergency lights illuminated the chamber beyond, revealing Alexander slumped in the chair with the breathing apparatus still functioning, but showing red warning lights on the oxygen tank. Dr. Holbrook was the first one through the opening, his medical bag in hand. He quickly checked Alexander's vital signs, while the firefighters worked to free him from the remaining restraints. He's alive, but in respiratory distress, Dr. Holbrook reported. The oxygen is nearly depleted, and he's showing signs of drug intoxication. We need to get him to a hospital immediately." As they carefully moved Alexander out of the chamber and onto a stretcher, he managed to grab Maria's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved my life." "Just rest now," Maria replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You're safe." The firefighters had found the injection vial that Victoria had used to drug Alexander, along with the forged inheritance documents that were supposed to transfer control of his assets. The evidence of premeditated attempted murder was overwhelming and undeniable. Victoria Sterling and Marcus Sterling were arrested at the scene. As the police led them away in handcuffs, Victoria's mask of sophistication finally slipped completely. "You have no idea what you've cost us," she spat at Maria. "We were so close to having everything." "You already had everything," Maria replied quietly. "Alexander loved you. He would have shared his life with you willingly." "But that wasn't enough, was it? You wanted it all, and you wanted him dead." As the ambulance carrying Alexander disappeared toward the hospital, Maria found herself alone in the basement, where it had all happened. The rescue equipment was being packed away, and the investigators were documenting the scene for the criminal case that would follow. Dr. Holbrook approached her before leaving. "Maria, what you did today took incredible courage. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't trusted your instincts and acted when you did, Alexander would have died in that chamber." "I've worked for this family for 15 years, Maria said simply. "Alexander has been like a son to me. I couldn't let anything happen to him." Later that evening, Maria received a call from the hospital. Alexander was recovering well from the drug's effects and would make a full physical recovery. The emotional trauma would take longer to heal, but he was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him, starting with his father, who had caught the first flight home from Europe. Richard Morrison arrived at the hospital that night, shaken by how close he had come to losing his son. When he learned the full details of what Maria had done, he was overwhelmed with gratitude. "Maria," he said when he called her the next day, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You risked your own life to save Alexander. Our family owes you a debt we can never repay." "Mr. Morrison, I was just doing what anyone would do for family. And that's what you've always been to me. Family." The investigation revealed that Victoria and Marcus Sterling had been planning their scheme for over a year. Marcus had been slowly gaining Richard Morrison's trust, while Victoria worked to become indispensable to Alexander. They had researched the family's finances, the layout of the estate, and even the work schedules of the staff to find the perfect opportunity for their crime. The forged documents would have given Victoria control of Alexander's inheritance immediately upon his death, while Marcus was positioned to become Richard Morrison's trusted advisor in his grief. Together, they would have systematically looted the Morrison family fortune over the following months. But their plan had one fatal flaw. They had underestimated the loyalty and courage of a woman they saw as merely the help. Maria Santos had proven that heroism comes in all forms, and that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of courage. Alexander made a full recovery and returned to running Morrison Industries with a new appreciation for the people who truly mattered in his life. He established a scholarship fund in Maria's name to help other hardworking immigrants pursue education for their children, and he made sure that Maria and her family would never have to worry about financial security again. Victoria Sterling and Marcus Sterling were convicted of attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. They received lengthy prison sentences that ensured they would never again pose a threat to the Morrison family or anyone else. But for Maria Santos, the greatest reward was simply seeing Alexander safe and knowing that she had been in the right place at the right time to make a difference. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important moments in life are the ones where ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things simply because it's the right thing to do. The Morrison estate returned to its peaceful routines, but everyone who worked there knew that they had witnessed something remarkable. They had seen how quickly evil could infiltrate even the most secure places, and how much difference one person's courage could make when everything seemed lost. And in the basement where Alexander had nearly died, the wine cellar was properly sealed and converted into a storage room. Nobody wanted to preserve a monument to Victoria Sterling's cruelty. Instead, the space became just another part of a house where people had learned never to take their safety, their family, or their loyal friends for granted again.